It's October, and as we're surrounded by all things frightening, it's time to talk about one of the scariest things that can happen to a taxpayer when dealing with an IRS debt, an IRS wage garnishment. Not only does the garnishment inform a taxpayer's employer that they owe the IRS money, it also puts the taxpayer in a tough financial situation. Here are the basics about what an IRS wage garnishment looks like and what taxpayers should do to avoid this from happening to them. When the IRS assesses a balance owed against a taxpayer and sends demand for payment that is not then paid, the IRS will typically then send the taxpayer a series of collections notices before initiating any collection activity. It is important that the taxpayer does not ignore the IRS notices that come in response to a balance owed. This is how many taxpayers find themselves under wage garnishment or other collection activity. It is always important to read, respond, react, and keep a copy of all IRS notices. There are typically 4 or 5 notices the IRS will send before issuing a final notice of intent to levy. The final notice of intent to levy will be sent via certified mail, and the letter number or notice number is generally an LT11, a CP90, or an LT1058. 30 days after the final notice of intent to levy has been issued, if no collection due process appeal has been filed, the taxpayer will then be at risk for collection activity. This means that at any point thereafter, the IRS can contact the taxpayer's employer with a wage garnishment. The IRS does not have to send an additional notice, even if years pass between the final notice of intent to levy and the wage garnishment. Unlike a bank levy, a wage garnishment is ongoing. The IRS will seize wages each pay period until the balance is paid in full, a formalized resolution request has been submitted, or the IRS otherwise agrees to release the garnishment. The IRS is entitled to all but an exempt amount that will still be paid directly to the taxpayer. The exempt amount is based on the standard deduction plus an amount calculated based on the number of dependents the taxpayer has. If a taxpayer has multiple sources of income in a pay period, it is possible that they may deem other income sources sufficient to cover the exempt portion required and garnish 100% of wages owed by a particular employer. Additionally, if the taxpayer receives bonus payments separate from base pay in the same pay period, the IRS is generally entitled to the full bonus as the exempt amount was calculated on the base pay. The taxpayer's employer will typically be sent a Form 668W to levy an individual's wages, salary, fees, bonuses, commissions, or other income. The employer will also receive instructions on how to calculate the exempt amount and where to send the levied proceeds. The employer has a legal obligation to turn over to the IRS any property owed to the taxpayer that the levy has been issued against. Employers usually have 1 pay period after receiving the notice before they are required to send funds. The taxpayer's employer will typically request that the taxpayer complete a statement of dependence and filing status. Without this statement, the employer will calculate the exempt amount as a married filing separately with 0 dependents taxpayer. The exempt amount calculations can be found on the IRS's publication 1494. For example, in 2022, a single taxpayer with no dependents would receive approximately $1,079.17 monthly as the exempt portion of wages. If you're terrified at the thought of the IRS contacting your employer to garnish your wages, it's time to contact Bryson Law Firm. IRS wage garnishments can be prevented. Contact us today, www.brysonlawfirm.com.